projects under my portfolio is mechanised ground preparation. So first of all, I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming along today and giving up a wee bit of time to learn about the framework agreement for mechanised ground prep that we're looking to put in place. So I'll start off the day by doing a wee presentation. It should take less than half an hour just on what it is we intend to put in place, why we're doing it, and how you can get involved in it. But at the same time, we will have a Q&A at the end, whereby if you've got anything that you don't understand or you want clarification on, you can ask me. And at the same time, we're also looking for feedback on what it is we're proposing to do through this tender exercise, as we want to get it right when we eventually do go out to tender. So any feedback that you provide us with may inform how we develop the tender strategy for this framework agreement. So you will have the opportunity to provide any feedback that you wish at the end of the session as well. So I'll just kick off by explaining, first of all, what is a framework agreement. So as I've defined there, it allows public authorities to procure goods, services and works from a list of pre-approved suppliers. So what does that mean in terms of mechanised ground prep and this framework agreement for FLS? So essentially what it is it's a group of pre-qualified suppliers that we're looking to establish that we can turn to either award or invite those suppliers to tender for requirements as and when they arise. So it's kind of a background system which sits there in addition to the contracts which we already have in place for mechanised ground prep operations. So I'll go into a wee bit more detail about that at the end, but just to be clear from the outset that there's no guarantee of work by being appointed to the framework agreement. It's really there to be used as a route to market by FLS as and when those types of applicable requirements come up. So that being said, there's sort of two procurement stages within a framework agreement. One of them being the actual establishment of the framework agreement, where we create that group of pre-qualified suppliers that I'm referring to, and then the call-off stage, whereby once the framework agreement is up and running and it has been established, we've got suppliers on it, call-off is where we would look to tender or award works through the framework agreement. So the next slide will give you a wee bit more detail on the process for each of them. So in terms of framework establishment, because this framework agreement, the total value of it is estimated to be above the regulated value for public procurement, we do have to do a qualification, technical and commercial assessment in the setup of the framework agreement. So by doing that, we would get responses back from tenderers who bid. Those responses would be evaluated and then they would be ranked based on who scored the highest and who scored the lowest. And from that framework agreement evaluation, we would then set the framework agreement out into lots, which are based on geographical areas, and the suppliers who have submitted a bid would be ranked from best to worst within each lot within the framework agreement. In terms of call-off, as I've said, this is what we're more concerned with, the establishing of the framework agreement at the moment, because that's the stage that we're at. But in terms of calling off from the framework agreement, once the framework's been established, as a requirement came up that we would look to tender through the framework agreement, we would then look to do that by either directly awarding or doing a further competition through the framework agreement. And at that point, we would award a contract through the framework agreement for the delivery of a specific requirement. So just to highlight the difference then between a framework agreement and a contract, as I've kind of said, by being appointed to the framework agreement, there's no commitment to deliver requirements from that alone. That's different to a contract. If you were to be awarded a call-off contract through the framework agreement, you would then have a commitment to deliver the requirements of that call-off contract. Obviously, a call-off contract would have an exact scope which is defined. It would have specific deliverables and obligations. So that's because the requirement that the call-off contract pertains to would be known at that time. And we would know the ins and outs yet. However, when we're scoping out the framework agreement and providing the specifications for the tender for the framework agreement, those documents tend to be a bit less tailored, less specific and more broad, because the framework agreement has to cover for all the different types of call-offs which could happen through the framework agreement. So when you're signing up to the framework agreement, the terms and conditions that you're signing up to govern all future call-offs which could happen through the framework agreement. But then if you were signing a call-off contract through the framework agreement, that call-off contract would have its own individual terms and conditions which were specific to the requirement that's being tendered through the framework. So why are we setting up this framework agreement? What will it be used for? So primarily the framework agreement is being set up to provide a route to market for services which we don't have the capacity to complete through our existing contracts. So if you are an existing contractor with FLS for these services, you don't have to be concerned about your existing contract. The framework agreement won't affect your existing contract in any way. It will still just go ahead as planned. The framework agreement is there to give us a route to market if there's any requirements which come up which we don't have the capacity, there isn't the capacity to put through those contracts. Other reasons that the framework agreement could be used would be if an existing contract was terminated. So if an existing contract was to fail for whatever reason and it had to go through the termination process, we could then turn to the framework agreement to re-tender for that terminated contract in its entirety. And the same logic also applies to the replacement of expired contracts. So if any contracts come to their natural expiry over the framework agreement duration, which we're proposing to be 4 years from the commencement of the framework agreement, we could use the framework agreement to re-tender for contracts in those circumstances as well. So in terms of the lotting structure of the framework agreement, we're looking to divide the framework into 6 geographical lots. Well, 5 geographical lots, and then 1 national lot for discarification services. So lots 1 to 5 there that you see are split up per region of Scotland's national forest and land. So those lots 1 to 5 cover the wider scope of mechanised ground preparation. And then, as I said, lot 6 is specifically for discarification and covers a national basis. So I'll go into the ins and outs of what the scope of services is that's included within each of those lots in a minute. But when you're coming to the point of tendering for the framework agreement, you would choose those lots which you would be looking to provide services in. And just to note on this as well, with regards to when we go out to tender, each of the lots will have a value against it, which the value would really represent the amount of work which could go through the framework agreement. And that would include for any works which are already contracted with FLS through our existing contracts. So although those works would likely go through our existing contracts, we have to include that value within the framework agreement value, just in case there was ever an instance where one of our existing contracts failed. We would have to have enough value apportioned to each framework agreement lot to allow us to re-tender that contract through the framework agreement. So it may appear a wee bit misleading at first glance in that, but it's just to be clear that the values are inclusive of the values which are already included in our existing contracts. But that's how we intend to split up in terms of lotting structure. To give you a kind of visual representation of the lots and a kind of rough graph or a rough map even, that's how the regions are split up between north, east, west, central and south. And just to reiterate, discarification lot would cover all of those lots on a national basis. So in terms of the scope of services that's included within each of those lots, so for lots 1 to 5, which cover the wider scope of ground prep works, the services which we're advertising for are split up between core services and non-core services. So your core services are those which you must provide in order to be able to be named on the framework agreement, be appointed on the framework agreement. So if you can't provide any of the core services, you would either as a main contractor or through subcontracting, you wouldn't be able to get on the framework agreement. The non-core services aren't strictly required to get on the framework agreement, but they would be desirable. And in addition to that, we would reserve the right to tender or award for those services, even though they aren't required of all suppliers. But just to run through them, the core services then trench mounding, inverted mounding, hinge mounding, brash raking, windrowing, scrape and screef, shallow trench, forward mounding, borrow pitting, V-drains, high and low spec access tracks, and excavator. And your non-core services, patch stripping, subsoiling, mechanical respacing, mulching, continuous mounding, base machine with grab. So moving on to the discarification law, it's the same logic that applies in terms of the split between core and non-core services, and the core services being required, the non-core services being desirable but not required. A much smaller scope within these lots, so we would be covering for core services, discarification, base machine with grab, and for non-core continuous mounding. So that is the single lot for discarification, which covers all the regions in Scotland's national forest and land. So in terms of how you can access the framework agreement, the same as the PIN prior information notice was published on Public Contracts Scotland in relation to this pre-market engagement that we're doing. The framework agreement notice will also be published on Public Contracts Scotland, and it's from there that you'll then be able to get access by going into the notice when it's published on PCS. You'll be able to get into Public Contracts Scotland tender, which is where we'll actually conduct the tender exercise. So framework agreement will be advertised in Public Contracts Scotland, but the submission of your tender response to get named on the framework agreement will take place through a different website called Public Contracts Scotland Tender. And if you haven't signed up to that, you would get a link to sign up to that when you try and access it through the notice. So as I said at the start, because this is a regulated tender, we're required to do a qualification, technical and commercial assessment in order to establish the framework agreement. So your qualification envelope, this is done through the submission of a single procurement document, or an SPD as it's commonly known. So your single procurement document, basically it evaluates on the minimum standards that we would expect to make sure you meet the minimum criteria that we would expect of a contractor who is providing mechanised ground prep ops to FLS. So it's essentially a kind of qualification questionnaire which is split. There's three main sections. The first section there, the information about the bidding organisation, is fairly simple. Your exclusion grounds section, this evaluates you to make sure you don't fail on any grounds, exclusion grounds such as things like a recent history of criminal convictions, conspiracy, corruption, failure to pay taxes or social securities, breaches of environmental law or labour laws, all things like that. And the criteria which is in that section is fairly common across all of the public sector and regulated contracts. The selection criteria section is the most kind of customisable to us in terms of ground prep itself. So this is where we set out the specific ground prep related minimum requirements that we would expect of a contractor who would be providing services through the framework agreement. So some examples of things which could be included in there would be things like insurances, qualifications, equipment, health and safety procedures and environmental management procedures, but that's just an example list. There could be other things which are included in there as well. So if you pass your qualification assessment, you would then have your technical and commercial assessments evaluated as well. So we intend to do the technical and commercial evaluations as a 50-50 split, so evenly weighted between the two different types of criteria. And one of the things I wanted to cover in this presentation, and I have covered in the pre-market engagement questionnaire, which I've published and looking for responses, and I'll cover that a wee bit later. But some feedback that we've had in previous land management tender exercises is that we're asking too many questions, and some of them are kind of irrelevant to the services that we're asking, so that we're looking to be delivered. So what we intend to do here is try and consolidate the number of technical questions that we're asking. And one way that we're proposing to do that is by introducing scenario-based questions, whereby we take some of the different elements which we had been asking in lots of different questions and try to consolidate them into scenario-based questions, whereby we can get more tailored responses which still demonstrate that we're going to get the service delivery that we require through the framework agreement. So I wanted to share just an example of a type of scenario-based question that we could ask through the technical assessment. And the reason I wanted to share this, so this by no means is what specifically would be asked in the framework agreement evaluation, but it could be something like this. We would provide maps to give context on the scenario that I'm going to discuss, but I wanted to share it just to get some feedback on whether there's anything which would need to be changed within a question like this, anything which would need to be amended, or any additional documentation that you would need to be provided with in order to provide a response to this question, because we want to make sure that when we go out to tender, we're providing all of the required information which needs to accompany the question in order for you to provide a response to something like this, because we don't want to be having to amend things and providing extra information after the tender period's already started. So I would welcome any feedback on this, but I'll read through it. So the next site you're delivering, as I said, maps would be provided to give more context on the situation, contains predominantly productive conifers with a requirement for even spacing at 2,700 mouths per hectare, with an element of broadleaves and riparian areas and wet flushes at 1,600 per hectare. The boundaries for the broadleaves and conifers, track, drains and watercourses have been marked. There are pockets of wind blowing some of the wetter areas where there are significantly heavier brash mats. So question 1 on the back of that could be, quality methodology. Please describe how you would manage the delivery of a consistent, even spacing across the productive areas of the site. Ensure that you and your operators had the understanding, skills and competencies to deliver the best result across the site, i.e. the most appropriate method based on soil type and site conditions to achieve minimised soil disturbance and rapid establishment. And ensure the site was planned and delivered efficiently and cost effectively. So within a question like that, the key things we would be looking for would be elements such as on-site monitoring, reporting to the FWM, rectification of spacing, soils document understanding, site planning. With regards to safety and environmental management, we could ask a question which asks to identify the key constraints on site from the constraints and hazard maps which would be provided, and describe how you would manage them. So key elements of the response could cover things like archaeology, barriers, power, water and gas supply, major water courses, buffers, crossing points, timing, fuel storage, maintenance area and welfare location. So if anybody's got any feedback on that, I would welcome at the end, or any suggestions. I'm all ears in terms of what people would suggest in terms of that. So if you've got that, please take note of it and we can come back and revisit that at the end. But I would also just emphasise that this question is included within the pre-market engagement questionnaire, which is accessible through Microsoft Forms, and I'll cover at the end. So if you would prefer to provide written feedback on this, you will have the opportunity to do that by completing the pre-market engagement questionnaire. So any feedback we can get in that is very welcome, because we want to get things right and make sure that when we're asking you to submit technical responses, the question actually makes sense and provides the information you need to do so. So in terms of the call-off options that we can use once the framework agreement is established, so just to remind you, this isn't really what we're concerned with right now, but you need to, just to give you an understanding of how the framework agreement will work and how we will use it once it's up and running. There are different ways in which we can call off. So one of those ways would be by direct award. So through direct award, we would award to the first rank supplier from the relevant lot based on the framework agreement evaluation. So as I said earlier, there's a framework agreement evaluation which takes place in the establishment of the framework agreement. So through that, we do a technical assessment and a commercial assessment, and the combination of those scores are what gives the overall score for each supplier. And from those overall scores, each lot is ranked from best to worst. So if a requirement came up through the framework agreement that we wanted to award by direct award, say it was in Central Region, we would go to the Central Region lot, we would look at the first ranked supplier from the framework agreement evaluation and we would offer it to them. If they couldn't complete it at that point in time, we would then move to the second ranked supplier, and if they couldn't complete it, third, and so on from there. Another method that we can use is mini competition. So this would be where we do a new technical and commercial evaluation based on the specific requirement that we're looking to tender through the framework agreement. So in this instance, everybody within the framework agreement lot, so say it was in the requirement was in West Region or Central Region, let's say West Region, we would go to the West Region lot and invite all the suppliers in the West Region to submit technical and commercial response. So if we were doing a mini competition and it was for a specific requirement, where the technical evaluation and the commercial evaluation in the framework would have been quite broad because it could cover a whole different range of things, the technical and commercial evaluation that would be done under a mini competition would be more tailored to the specific requirement that we're tendering through the framework agreement. So in the commercial evaluation, the price lines would be relevant specifically to what we were asking you to do at that point. So yeah, all suppliers in the lot would be invited to bid, as I said, and the award would go to the highest scoring supplier from the mini competition as well. The other type of call-off that we would be looking to use for the framework agreement would be desktop evaluation. So if you think of desktop evaluation almost like half of a mini competition, whereby we wouldn't be reopening the technical evaluation, but we would reopen the commercial evaluation. So the technical scores that you received through the framework evaluation would still stand, but we would reevaluate on new price lines, which are specific to the specific requirement that we were looking to tender for. So it just allows us to reevaluate on price if we find it's necessary to do so, and you wouldn't have to resubmit a technical response as well. So similar to a mini competition, all suppliers in each lot would be in the relevant lot would be invited to bid for that, and the award would go to the highest scoring supplier, and the scores would be combined between the technical evaluation score that you got at the framework agreement and the new commercial score that you got on the specific price lines that were re-evaluated for the desktop evaluation. So the next thing I wanted to cover is community benefits. So community benefits, we would be looking for community benefits to be delivered through the framework agreement, but we also at the same time want to make sure that the delivery of community benefits is proportionate to the value of services delivered through the framework agreement. So the way that we're intending or proposing to do that would be by looking at the total awarded annual contract value of each supplier across all lots of the framework agreement, and then applying that to a points-based system for community benefits. So looking at the table that's on the screen, just to take an example, if you were awarded a contract in year one of the framework agreement for £100,000, you wouldn't be required to then deliver community benefits in the back of that because you wouldn't meet that £200,000 threshold, so no requirement to deliver community benefits. However, if at the end of year one, towards the end of year one, you were awarded another contract worth £150,000, so your total for year one was £250,000, you would then have a requirement to deliver on 1 point of community benefits. So within the framework agreement documentation, there will be a table which allocates points to a list of different community benefits. And from there, you would, if you knew you were to deliver on 1 point, you would go to the table and you would communicate to FLS which community benefit from the table you were going to deliver to meet that 1 point. And then that would then be managed through contract management of the framework agreement. So it's just to illustrate that just by we are expecting community benefits to be delivered through the framework, what we're proposing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the first time you get awarded a contract, you're going to be required to deliver on that. It would only be once you reach a threshold as per the table there. And through the pre-market engagement questionnaire, I've got a couple of questions on community benefits as well, just asking the types of things that we're proposing within the points-based system, whether they're feasible, whether they would be achievable, and if there's any issues in achieving those things, we would like to hear back some feedback on that. But the points will be allocated, so more points will be allocated to community benefits, which are of more value, and less points to those which are seen as less valuable. So just to finish up, then I want to give you an overview of the indicative timescales for the project. First of all, PIN response, so that refers to the pre-market engagement questionnaire, which I've mentioned a couple of times. So you can get onto the pre-market engagement questionnaire through the PIN notice itself or through the PIN supporting document on PCS. So it's a Microsoft Forms questionnaire. You can just complete it online and submit it through that, and the responses will come through to me automatically. And your feedback on that would really be appreciated if you're intending on going for this requirement to get on the framework agreement, because the information that we get back could influence how we decide to go out to tender. So any responses to that would be greatly appreciated, and the deadline for that is 12 o'clock on Monday the 27th of May. So the rest of these are indicative timelines, as it says. These are the dates that we're intending to go for. There may be a wee bit movement on that, but we're intending to publish the PCS notice for the framework agreement in the middle of August. If we got to it in the middle of August, we would be looking to get the responses to it back by the end of September. and then awarding at the beginning of December and signing the framework in January, so that we could then start using the framework agreement as a route to market around about February time next year. But that's me. I'll stop my presenting now, but I just want to say again, thanks everybody for listening to that. I hope that's kind of clarified and cleared up some things. But again, if anybody's got any questions or feedback that they can provide us, particularly with some of the things I spoke about, like the technical questions or any other aspect of my presentation, I would welcome any feedback on that. And as Francis at the start, I'll try my best to answer any questions. If I don't have the answers right now, I'll take them away and make sure they're uploaded onto the PCS system so that the information is shared with everybody. But thanks again. Thanks for listening.